I want to ask a little bit more about these recent reports of sort of satellite police stations being set up in Canada. So there appears to be evidence of physical street addresses where there are these supposed 3 satellite police offices representing police forces of the People's Republic of China in the Toronto area. I do think Canadians would be very surprised and frankly disturbed to learn that. The representative from Global Affairs has confirmed that there is an investigation going on into this. Is that correct?
Mr. Chair, that's correct. There are we are waiting for evidence, not just from media reports, but from operations underway, and so I won't speak further to the detail of that. And I think specific questions on that should be directed to the RCMP. Thank you.
Could you confirm if you did find out that these reports were in fact true? Would that be announced publicly or reported publicly?
Mr. Chair, I'd have to defer to the RCMP as to whether they would make that announcement publicly or not.
So Global Affairs is working with the RCMP and the RCMP is leading the investigation into this, is that correct?
Mr. Chair, we are working closely with all relevant partners to understand whether there's grounds to these very disturbing allegations. And obviously, if there are, we will be taking relevant action in our lane, which is the diplomatic lane.
If proven to be true, these satellite offices would be completely illegal and would represent a significant violation of Canada's national sovereignty. Is that correct?
Mr. Chair, the activity that's being alleged would be entirely illegal, totally inappropriate, and would be the subject of very serious representations and follow-up diplomatically. Thank you.
But it seems like when the Americans discuss Taiwan, they rarely mention Canada at all. And it seems to be that they don't feel that we're a relevant player in the Indo-Pacific. We're not an AUKUS, we're not part of the quadrilateral security dialogue, we really haven't been doing a whole heck of a lot to equip our Arctic for defense. Just wondering if you can weigh in on your thoughts on that. Are we a relevant player in the Indo-Pacific in terms of Taiwan or others in the minds of the U.S., and is that important?
I think that you've sort of hit the nail on the head there. I think if you look at the United States Indo-Pacific strategy, I did a quick search, a PDF search of Canada, and it came up 0 times. There's no mention of Canada. And I think in discussions with Americans, they won't say that we're doing this to punish you and say that whether it's certain decisions in your relationship with China, but it's just that we didn't think of you. So what is worse, to be punished or to be irrelevant in these discussions? I would argue that the irrelevance is probably a worse sort of outcome, but I think that's the reality right now on this specific matter.
What grade would you provide the current government for living up to their values of human rights in terms of what we're talking about today in investments of our pension plan in these various Chinese companies and others?
You know, we really have to be much more aware of the implications of our investment in terms of, you know, whether we're enabling a regime which is potentially hostile. There are a lot of other areas in which we, unless we really are on top of exactly where the money is going and who is using it, can be used for methods that are hostile both to our values and to Canada's national interests. So I'd like to see, if we're going to invest in China, a lot more government supervision of what our pension plans and university endowments are doing.
There's been a few announcements as of late from the Minister of Defense regarding surveillance and upgrading NORAD, and recently she was interviewed on CTV Question Period. She said that they are investing in our military bases. Do you feel that the announcements made by the current government and the Minister of Defense, are they giving you hope that the current government is taking this issue seriously? Do you think that they're enough? What should be done in addition? If you can just outline for the committee.
What we're not seeing is really what that means in the much longer term for China, and particularly on the maritime side. Now, when we look at what has been promised in terms of NORAD modernization, recognize also that the $4.9 billion is being drawn out of the $8.1 of the budget. So that's not new money that was announced in June. That is what we'll be doing with what is coming out of the defense budget. Now, in the longer term, the real problem that we'll be facing with the Chinese is going to be their maritime capability. Most people will not be aware that the Chinese have the largest Navy in the world. The American Navy is still stronger and better. It has a better carrier capability, but in numbers, Chinese Navy overtook the American Navy about 2014, 2015. And they are going to have that capability. They will focus on underwater capabilities. They're reinvigorating their entire submarine force. And what we can see from outside scientific literature, they're examining to what it means for their submarines to go under the ice, which means into the Arctic region.
I do have concern that given the company that received the contract that is ultimately owned in part by a company, Hytera, as mentioned by my colleague, which is based in the People's Republic of China, we know that some of that technology in this contract is already being implemented in Ontario and Saskatchewan. And I have not heard from Minister Champagne or the Prime Minister or the Minister of Public Safety whether this pause of the contract will mean that that technology that's already in place, again for surveillance purposes for RCMP, quite shocking when you consider that the parent companies are in part are owned by the People's Republic of China, is now sort of responsible now for the surveillance technology of RCMP. I have not heard from this government of whether they will be insisting the removal of that technology. You would have thought that, or I would have thought that would have been one of the first things they would have committed to, that if there is any threat to our national security and setting a precedent in this surveillance industry that we have in Canada, whether it's for national security or within our telecoms utilized by, for example, the Department of National Defense, you would think that they would set a clear standard that this is unacceptable and it will be removed immediately. But we did see with the Liberal government, they took about 5 years to commit to removing the Huawei technology. And because it took so long, it'll cost hundreds of millions of additional dollars that will be passed down to the consumer. Huawei and the 5G technology we saw has so infiltrated our telecommunications systems that it will be very hard work to remove that. So I have those same concerns with what's happening here. And we know, and was mentioned by my colleague, that there, from the U.S. Department of Justice earlier this year, I believe in February 2022, there was a federal indictment unsealed that showed that there were 21 counts of 21 counts of charges of conspiracy to commit theft of trade secrets of Hytera. So we see that in the United States, they're being very aggressive and transparent with the threat that Hytera, which again is sort of the parent of the parent company that owns Sinclair. So we see the Americans taking very strong action on this, and yet we have not seen the Prime Minister or the Minister of Industry or the Minister of Public Safety make a very clear statement that this surveillance technology that is being provided by this ultimately Chinese-owned company, so to speak, will be removed in Ontario and Saskatchewan. So I'd like to hear that, and I'd like the Minister of Public Safety and the Minister of Industry to come to this committee and make that commitment. My next question is on critical technologies, jumping around a little bit. Taiwan, microchip semiconductors, there's been a lot of discussion that if China takes over Taiwan, so to speak, that they would be, in essence, in full control of the largest producer of semiconductors, microchips in the world, and that we would be, us along with most other countries in the world, be very vulnerable. Has Canada had any discussions with our allies to make us less reliant on Taiwan for this? Is this on the radar?
How do we work with partners to ensure that disruption to an essential part of everything we do in our whole economy is something we don't wait to plan for the day after there's an embargo, et cetera. So there are very active discussions. The premise from the Chinese government that what happens across the Taiwan Strait is an internal affair with respect. Even the kind of exercise they undertook in August would have an immediate global economic impact. That's why organizations like the Rhodium Group have sort of responded to your question, but just by isolating even a more limited impact. And it would make the economic impact of Ukraine looks small in comparison.
The last time you were here, there was a story breaking about those alleged 3 Chinese-run police stations operating illegally in Canada. I'm wondering if you've had an official dialogue or bilateral meeting with the ambassador to express Canada's outrage of these allegations.
The short answer is yes. We've had several engagements. We've called the ambassador in on multiple occasions, and we have conveyed our deep concern. The government of Canada has formally insisted that the Chinese government take account for, including the ambassador and his embassy, for any activities within Canada that fall outside of the Vienna Conventions, and account for those, ensure that they cease and desist, and we continue to hold open the possibility of following up on those meetings with further decisions for how we take that forward, depending on how they respond.